been a while. Nice to be back in the saddle. Been on hiatus for a few weeks and coming straight out the gate with a barnstormer of a concept today, which I think a lot of people are going to enjoy. Something very different, I think. So my guest today is Professor David Benatar. David is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cape Town, South Africa, where he teaches courses on moral philosophy and applied ethics. He is the author and editor of a number of books, including The Second Sexism, Discrimination Against Men and Boys, The Human Predicament, A Candid Guide to Life's Biggest Questions, and probably most famously, a book called Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence. David, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Okay, so, not to start off on a morbid note, but the reason I wanted to speak to you today is, so my dad passed away recently, a few weeks ago, in fact.
Really?
I've already spoken, I've done an episode about that, sort of spoken about my experience. And I've always had always had a close conceptual relationship with death. I've always had sort of one eye on the bitter end, I guess would be the best way to put it. But I've still somehow managed to sort of shy away from more exploring pessimistic subjects. I think I've sort of looked at death the same way that sort of Perseus watches Medusa through the reflection in his shield. I've kind of done it in that sort of sense, but this experience has made it sort of more real for me, but strangely in a sort of empowering way, in a way that I feel like I sort of want to stare death and mortality and morbidity and meaning and pessimism. I just sort of want to stare all that in the face. And it was a bit sort of serendipitous, really, I think, because it was only a couple of days after my dad passed away that I stumbled across an article about your work. It was on the Human Predicament. And then I went down the David Benatar rabbit hole, pessimism, antinatalism, and I was like, I need to speak to this guy. And so I think antinatalism, it's from what the research I've been doing on it with the internet, it seems quite a contentious issue. And you read some of it online, people get sort of very emotional about it. And so what I start by saying is I don't want to frame this as a debate. You know, you've debated greater minds than me on this topic, and so people can go and find those conversations elsewhere. What I really want to do with this episode, I just want to sort of meander through some of your ideas, get people thinking, and just sort of play around with some of the concepts involved. And I'm hoping you can have a bit of fun with me as well today, David, because I'm already a father of two, and I'm thinking me and the missus are thinking of having a third one. And I've told her about this conversation with you today, and she's worried because she's worried you're going to talk me out of it. And I thought that might be a good premise, a good gravitational center to work around. So, all that said, let's jump into this. Double-edged question, I think. Firstly, what is the human predicament? If you could kind of give us a brief introduction to these twin concepts, I guess, of the human predicament and how it relates to anti-natalism, if you will, please.
Sure. I think the human predicament, expressed briefly, is that life is awful, but so is death.
Yes.
And so we're caught between a rock and a hard place once we exist. And so the only real way to avoid the human predicament is by never coming into existence in the first place. We're spared a great deal, both within life and then, of course, spared death itself. Okay.
Well, what I'm going to ask, actually, before we actually get into the thick of this, if you could could you flesh that out for me a little bit with some of the basic, the pillars that concept sort of rests on?
Sure. So if you look at life, there is plenty of bad that befalls us. And none of this, of course, happens to the people who never come into existence. Now, it is also true that the good things that happen to existing people don't happen to those people who don't exist. But there are a number of asymmetries between the good things and the bad things that I think lead to the conclusion that life is on balance not good. It's certainly not better. It's a lot worse than never coming into existence in the first place. Now, some of these asymmetries, I think, are quite easy to understand. These are what I call the more empirical asymmetries. So if you look, for example, at the amount of pain and pleasure that there is in life, there's going to be more pain than there is pleasure. Now, this is a counterintuitive idea to many people, but just think about it for a moment. Think about how long pains go on. And think about the phenomenon, for example, of chronic pain. There's no comparable phenomenon of chronic pleasure. There is chronic satisfaction, but there's also chronic dissatisfaction that offsets that. So if we look purely at the pain and pleasure as opposed to satisfaction and dissatisfaction, you're going to find that pains tend to go on longer than pleasures. Think about the best pleasures that there are, probably sexual pleasures, maybe gustatory pleasures. These are pleasures that are relatively short-lived, whereas pains, including quite severe pains, can go on for a very long time. So that's one way in which there's going to be more pain than pleasure. Then think about how bad the worst pains are versus how good the best pleasures are. Well, the worst pains are much worse than the best pleasures are good. And if you want some instruction as to why that's the case, just think about the following deal. Let's imagine somebody said, well, I will give you an hour of the worst torments imaginable in exchange, let's say, for 2 hours or 3 hours or 4 hours of the most sublime pleasures that there are. You won't take that deal if you're sane. And I think that's another indication that the worst pains are worse than the best pleasures are good. Now, so far I've been speaking only about pleasures and pains, but many people want to say that the good things and bad things in life are not reducible simply to pleasure and pain. They think there are other goods, but I think if we look at those other goods, we find the same thing. We find that the goods are heavily outweighed by the bads. So think about the satisfaction of desires, for example. So we have many more desires than we have satisfied desires. So there's going to be more unfulfilled desires than fulfilled desires. Even when your desires are fulfilled, it often takes a very long time until they're fulfilled because of all the striving that it takes to get there. And then when they are fulfilled, they invariably cease to satisfy after a period of time. And so they yield to new desires, or the same desire reoccurs. And so this is another example. Or think about certain objective goods that some people might think characterize lives, and think about objective bads. So many people think, for example, that knowledge is a good thing. Well, if we look at the spectrum from knowing nothing to knowing everything, from knowing nothing to being omniscient, we are much, much closer to the end of the spectrum of knowing nothing than to being omniscient. So if you think that more knowledge is better, you're going to think that we're actually faring pretty badly on the knowledge scale. If you want to think about longevity, well, if you could live either for a second or you could live for eternity, we're much closer to a second than to eternity. So all the sorts of things which people typically take to be goods, we actually have in quite limited amount in our lives. So that's one kind of asymmetry. It's an empirical asymmetry, and I think this shows that there's more bad in life than there is good. But there's also what I call an axiological or kind of value asymmetry between good things and bad things. And what I want to argue here is that it's good to avoid the bad things, even if the way to avoid the bad things is by avoiding creating the person who will experience those bad things. So let's imagine you could create a child and that child would suffer a great deal. The way you can avoid that suffering is by not creating the child. Well, I think that's a good thing to do. It's good to try to avoid that suffering, even if the way to do it is by avoiding creating the child. But then, of course, if you don't create this child, the few goods that it would have in its life would also be missing. But I don't think that the absence of those goods is bad, and I think it's not bad because there's nobody who is deprived of them. So there's this interesting sort of value asymmetry, I think, between the absence of bad things and the absence of good things. So, I mean, this is obviously just a sketch of an argument, but I think it suggests why life contains more bad than good, and why it would be better not to create new beings that will lead lives of this kind.
Yeah, there's plenty for us to get our teeth into there. What I wanted to do before we do that as well is, again, reading online and listening to some of the debates you've engaged in. that I just want to sort of avoid straight away is people seem to find it hard when discussing this argument of yours. They seem to find it difficult to distinguish between what I guess would be the pro-mortalist idea. I think that's what it's called, and the antinatalist idea. The pro-mortalist idea being, well, if life's so bad, why doesn't everybody just kill themselves? And if you know, if you as an antinatalist stand by your convictions, you'd kill yourself as well. And the antinatalist idea being just not bringing new life into existence in the first place. So I'm curious. Why do you think people find it? I mean, even some sort of like genius minds, like Sam Harris, you debated, seemed to trip up on this concept, and Jordan Peterson did as well. Why do you think even minds as great as theirs get caught up in failing to distinguish between those two ideas?
Well, I think the antinatalist idea is one that does not go down well with most people, and I think there are deep evolutionary psychological reasons for why that's the case, or explanations, let's put it, for why people are deeply resistant. We exist. We like to believe that things are better than they really are. We have sort of an optimism bias, and that sort of trait is going to be selected for by our evolutionary history. Many people, most people, in fact, reproduce, so they produce children of their own. They don't want to view themselves as very wicked beings that are responsible for a great amount of suffering that their children experience. And so I think there's a great deal of resistance to the antinatalist idea. And so you're quite correct that a common response is to just say, and I have got this a lot. So let's set aside, for example, the people who are thinking about this more intelligently. An often reflex response is simply to say, well, why haven't you killed yourself? And if you think about it, it's a really harsh kind of thing to say to somebody. But it's a way of dismissing an idea and dismissing an argument because I think it makes you feel uncomfortable.
Right.
And I've argued at length that I don't think that antinatalism implies pro-mortalism. And one reason is that once you exist, I think you've got a reason and an interest in continuing to exist. We've got an interest in continuing to exist, and that's going to be thwarted if you take your own life. So something will be lost by dying. You'll also avoid certain evils, that's true, but you will also lose something through dying. Whereas if you never brought into existence in the first place, you lose nothing.
Yep.
Nothing is lost in that process. And that's why I think there's an important asymmetry again there between not coming into existence and ceasing to exist. Now, some of the things that went on in the debate with Sam Harris, for example, and with Jordan Peterson, I think were qualitatively different. Sam Harris, for example, was pushing a kind of Epicurean line that you're not there after you're dead, and so how can you be harmed? And I think that's a separate argument. The Epicurean argument is a separate argument, and I acknowledge to him that if the Epicurean argument is sound, then my view would imply pro-mortalism. But quite frankly, you wouldn't have to be an antinatalist in order to support pro-mortalism if you're an Epicurean. Because if you're an Epicurean, there's really nothing to be lost by dying, and something perhaps to be gained in a sense, although there's some technicalities with saying that, some technical problems with saying that. You can spare yourself a great deal of suffering if you were to end your life. And so the Epicurean argument is not a challenge uniquely to me. It's a challenge to anybody who thinks that we've got an interest in continuing to exist. It's a challenge to anybody who thinks that death is bad for the person who dies.
Okay, and just to sort of clear the board here, I mean, this question, this is one that's going to warrant an entire episode all of its own. But just out of interest, expanding on that just very quickly, because again, it's the distinction seems quite clear to me. But incidentally, what are your views on suicide?
My view is that generally it is not a solution to the human predicament, precisely because we do have an interest in continuing to exist, and you thwart that interest in taking your own life. And also the problems that we have in our life with the absence of meaning are actually compounded by ending your life earlier rather than later. Because I think the only meaning in our lives is the meaning that we generate ourselves in the terrestrial realm. normally ending your life earlier is going to reduce your capacity to generate meaning. Not always, but usually. And so there are lots of reasons, I think, why it would not be good to take your own life. But I do not want to preclude it in all circumstances. So when somebody is in extremis, when they are suffering a terminal disease, they're suffering unbearably, the only way to control the suffering is by losing their autonomy, their dignity, they've got no realistic prospects, well, then it seems to me that suicide or assisted suicide may well be reasonable in those cases, not because your death is no longer bad for you in some way, but that at that point your life has become so bad that your interest in avoiding all that misery is actually stronger than your interest in continuing to exist. So I'm not categorically opposed to suicide. I think it has its place and its time, but I don't think it's a generalized solution to the human predicament by any means. I think it exacerbates it.
Right, okay. I think we've done a good job of sort of sweeping the board now. We know what we're dealing with. I've got to ask, though, I'm super intrigued by this, because it's such this idea of, having children, bringing more life into the world, it's morally objectionable, it's morally wrong. It's such a counterintuitive idea. I mean, even when I stumbled across it, it was completely new to me. I'd never really come across anything like that idea before. So I'm intrigued in your sort of the evolution of this idea for you, like the origins of it. As how did you come to believe this so strongly?
It seems obvious to me, and it seemed obvious to me for a very long time. And I've got to say, I don't think I'm alone in that, because I've had lots of people communicating with me over the years for whom it also seems obvious. So it may be that we've just got variation here between people. I grant that people like me who think it's obvious are probably a minority, and a very small minority, although perhaps not quite as small as you would think, certainly not as small as I previously thought. But that's not unusual. It's not unusual, I think, for some people to see some things and other people to see other things.
But I'm just wondering, is it something that, as you got into philosophy, was it sort of an idea that you stumbled across that other philosophers had already started talking about, or was it like you've said, it's intuitive to you in a way that it's certainly not to me? I mean, maybe even from a young age.
Yes, it seemed intuitive to me from well before I studied philosophy formally.
Wow.
But then when I encountered certain philosophical problems pertaining to future generations, these problems are really quite intractable problems. I recognized that this view that I held actually, in my opinion, solves many of those problems. And so it was actually quite a useful philosophical thought in dealing with these conundrums.
Right, okay. So let's dive into this now. Around this, let's crack on with convincing me not to have this third kid.
Don't do it.
Okay, so right. So I've got a quote from your book, The Human Predicament, here. I think it's a good one. I mean, we've already skimmed over this, but it's good to sort of get a little deeper now. So even the best lives, contrary to popular opinion, ultimately contain more bad than good. And there are compelling explanations why this unfortunate feature of our condition is not widely recognised. So 2 questions there. Especially even the best lives, contrary to popular opinion, ultimately contain more bad than good. I get you. So I know you've given the example of things like chronic pain, and that's more likely than chronic pleasure. But that's definitely not intuitively. It just doesn't sit right with me, and I'm wondering how do we qualify, but more particularly, how do we quantify that statement that there's more bad than good, and especially when we're talking about even in the best lives. We're thinking about someone that lives in the West who's maybe a multimillionaire, access to anything they want. Maybe someone that's in a good family situation. They're having in a faithful, happy marriage. Healthy kids. How even in that life is the bad outweighing the good?
Well, I think you may have an overly optimistic view about what those lives are like. So you say they've got happy marriages and healthy kids, but it's not going to last. Life always ends badly. It always ends badly.
Right.
I mean, it can vary in how badly it ends, but it's quite common in the developed world for people to die, for example, of cancer.
Yes.
That's a common way for people to die, and that's a pretty protracted death, often filled with suffering, certainly filled with anxiety about an approaching end for many people, and often reduced to states of indignity, and then death, and then you are obliterated for the rest of time, and your family, no matter how well off, are bereaved. And once you're dead, they'll be bereaved by the death of your spouse if everything's going in the right order, as it were, if the generations are dying in the right order. You're going to mourn the death of siblings and spouses, and all kinds of people are going to die before you yourself die. So there's plenty, even if things look in a snapshot. Let's imagine you look at a snapshot in a family album and you've got everybody smiling there. It's just a snapshot. It's a moment of pleasure. But think about, I've spoken about suffering that leads up towards death, and I've spoken about death, but think about sort of daily frustrations that people have. Because the universe doesn't serve life up, it doesn't serve pleasures up and good things up for us on a platter. There's got to be a constant state of striving in order to keep unpleasantness at bay. And even the people with the best lives are not going to be entirely successful. They're going to be much more successful than people who are impoverished and people who are born with congenital conditions. And so the best lives will be much better than the other ones, or perhaps we should say much less bad than the others. But they're going to have a lot of bad in them. And I find the more you push people, the more you go beneath the surface, the more you find how much unhappiness there is. Now, I'm not saying there are no optimists, and I'm not saying there are no cheery people about, but I also don't think that they have an entirely accurate view of the world. And I think we do need to look at our evolutionary background to see why it would select for the sort of optimism that wants to suppress the bad things. There's very good psychological evidence that people will suppress the recollection of bad things, that they'll have unduly optimistic views about where their life is going. This is a common and well-established phenomenon, and it's not surprising given our evolutionary history.
I've got to say, sort of, one thing that's sort of come up there for me is in this idea of sort of quantifying the bad versus the good. There's also there's a middle ground. There's a middle ground of experience which are the sort of neutral and ordinary or unremarkable. And I'd argue that it's those unremarkable experiences that if you was asked to gauge them in the moment, you'd say, well, you know, it's not great, but it's not bad either. It just is. I'd argue that it's those moments that take up the majority of our existence. And that being the case, I'm wondering where the anti-natalist perspective would stack them up. Because if we're sort of in a sort of mathematical way, we're weighing one against the other, you could argue that at the very least, those the sort of mundane and the ordinary experiences, at least if they're not pleasurable, there's the absence of pain, which would make them valuable enough to maybe stick them in the pleasure category. I don't know if I'm conveying that in a way that makes sense, but I don't know. I'll throw that over to you.
So let me say a few things. First of all, we can't get a precise calculation here.
No, of course.
I mean, the subject matter just doesn't allow us to do that. We don't have equipment to measure these things precisely, in part because we don't have an agreement on what the appropriate measures are. In other words, some people think we ought to be looking only at pleasures and pains. Other people think we should be looking at the satisfaction of desires. Other people think we should be looking at objective goods. So we get disagreements of that kind. But even if we resolve disagreements of that kind, we don't have the equipment to measure how much pain and pleasure people have from day to day. So we have to sort of work on self-reports and things like that. So that's a sort of level of ignorance that we have, but both optimists and pessimists have that same level of ignorance. So now what we need to do is we need to sort of think intelligently about what is likely the case in the absence of these very precise measures. And I've given you some now, but there are others in the book that you've mentioned. Some ways of thinking about this. And what I'm trying to show is that if you think about the kinds of things that we take to be good and the kinds of things we take to be bad, we've actually got very good reason, even without doing the precise measurements, for thinking that there's going to be more bad than good. Now, you mentioning the sort of mundane cases. Now, it's hard to know how to cash those out because you want to lump them in with the pleasures, but sometimes those mundane things really amount to boredoms, which are perhaps better lumped in with the unpleasant things in life, the bad things in life. But let's imagine they really were neutral. Well, then they would sort of be zero in the calculus. And so you wouldn't really be creating a child for the zero moments. That's not going to be what's going to settle it. And so, well, look, my child's going to be a large number of zero moments. Whether it's not unhappy and it's not happy. That seems bizarre to be creating a child for that. And yes. What that means is how are we going to settle this matter is by looking at the good and the bad. And there I think there's more bad than good.
Yeah, it's when you evoke that concept of what you're considering when you're thinking about bringing a child into the world, it is separate from, like, as a motivation to bring a child in the world. It doesn't make sense. Like, let's give this child a lifetime of boredom. Whereas I think I'm already falling into the trap of considering it from a person that's already here. And when I'm trying to quantify the bad versus the good, and I'm saying, well, you know, the mundane, the unremarkable, because there's the absence of pain, then at least that counts for something. But like you've just said, it doesn't make for a very good reason to say, let's get pregnant.
So I think the point you made is a good one, because a common mistake I think people make when they're thinking about creating new people is to actually think about an existing person. And that's a mistake. Because I think there are two different questions. One question is a life worth starting? And a different question is a life worth continuing? And I think that those sort of zero moments that you're speaking about do not count against continuing your life. And in fact, they might count in favor of continuing your life because of this interest in continuing. But if you're talking about starting a life, it would be absurd to start a life for those moments. I happen to think it's even absurd to start them for the good moments. But that I recognize as a more controversial claim. And I don't need to make that in order to address the particular point you were making.
Oh, but what I mean, just before I forget it, that would be, I am interested in you expanding on that, because that's interesting.
Well, that's got to do with the axiological asymmetry that I mentioned earlier. Because the absence of good things is not bad unless there's somebody who's deprived of it. When you're thinking about whether to create a person, if you don't create them, then there won't be a person who has those pleasures. But the absence of those pleasures won't be bad because there's nobody who's deprived. Whereas by not creating the person, you avoid the bad things, but that's a good thing. It's good to avoid the bad things, even if the way to do that is by not having a person who enjoys the absence of the bad.
Yeah, that's a tricky one to get past, because, you know, as a parent, when you're thinking about having kids, and it's those ideas. It's you know, I would be a good parent. I see other parents that aren't good parents, and I see kids that have a bad upbringing, and I can provide a good upbringing for my kid, and I think I can teach them the right things. And, you know, from a material perspective, we're fine, and we can give them a good life and a good education.
But there are lots of things to be said there. So first of all, let me commend you for actually thinking about having children, because a large number of children are created without anybody thinking about it.
Yeah, of course.
They're just mistakes, as it were.
Yeah, but what you've just said, David, is again, those are all fine things for someone that's already here, but to deprive somebody who never even comes into existence of those things is completely irrelevant. Like,
well, you're not depriving anybody. That's the point. No, nobody...
Yeah, that's. I'm gonna have to let that swirl around and maybe come back to that, because obviously that's one of the big things you talk about when it's making the decision to have a child.
But let me address one or two other things you said there, okay. Because you said about how your ability to provide for children and how you'd be a good parent, and So I don't know you, and I just don't take this personally, but I'm sure that there are more people who think they will be and are good parents than really will be or are good parents.
No, oh, yeah, of course, yeah.
So I'm sure there are a lot of people who are kidding themselves about that. But even the people who I think would be relatively good parents, I think they're overestimating the degree of control that they can have over their child's life and how good it will be. So when one has a child and you're planning on rearing it, you're sort of assuming you're not going to be struck down by a coronary before the child reaches adulthood. Your child might be orphaned, might be reared by a completely different set of people. Or it might be that your child itself gets sick and seriously sick. This happens in some cases. Or it might be that great nasty world out there from which you can't entirely shield your child will harm your child in all kinds of ways that you can't actually stop. And the only way you could stop it to some extent would be by cloistering the child, which would in fact ill prepare it for the real world when it ultimately got out there. And so the hazards of creating and rearing a child are immense.
Another one, and it just reminded me, another point, I can't remember where I heard you say this, and it's definitely true this. You were saying now that when people sort of consider the idea of having a child, they never consider, there's a cut-off point. You sort of imagine the child up to being about the age 20. You don't think that the child's going to have to be 60, 70, 80 years old and start getting old and decrepit and falling to pieces.
Yes.
I don't...
That's normally off the radar of most prospective parents.
It is. It's something...
about little baby they're going to get. They're not thinking about the old decrepit person in which that baby is ultimately going to grow. And
that's a tricky. It's a tricky concept to think of. It's like I say, as one of these people I'm definitely not an optimist. I'm definitely in the pessimist category. And I have those moments, these morbid moments where maybe we're all sitting around at the dinner table, just having a nice meal, everyone's sort of chitty chatting, and I look at my kids and think, "You're gonna die one day."
Yes.
And that idea of it, that breaks my heart. Like the idea that my children, they are going to get old, and they're going to get their hearts broken, and they're going to go through all these trials and tribulations. But however, despite that, I feel like there's, and this is again, it's almost falling into the trap of considering people that are already here. This idea of negative experience sort of bestowing positive benefits.
That's the Jordan Peterson line.
What's that? Sorry, David.
That's the Jordan Peterson line.
Yeah, I think as somebody, I do this psychology, mental health podcast. I've been through, my own struggles that I talk about, and when you're in it, it's awful. But coming out of the other side of these things, retrospectively, you do grow from them. You do in an almost in a sort of sick way, I guess, that you're glad you went through them, because I as bad as the times I've been through, I cannot bring myself to say that I just wish I'd never been through them. I can't bring myself to say it because of the person I've become as a result of it. And then when you sort of couple that with all the like the more sentimental aspects of life, that the memories of high school, first day at school, falling in love, and your first girlfriend, and the experiences I have of just watching my children play on the beach and things like that. I think if you couple those two concepts, just the good moments that are not necessarily inevitable, that are available to people, and the idea that yes, you're going to go through negative experiences, but they can be ultimately positive, and that people can learn to grow from them. That to me feels like a justification for saying, I want to sort of in a non-selfish way. I like the idea of giving somebody the opportunity to experience that. And
just think about that for a moment.
Okay.
So you say give somebody who? to whom are you giving this? I mean, there isn't anybody. And so one of the early comments you made a few moments ago was quite astute. I thought you sort of recognized that you were confusing the future person case with the existing person case, and so I think it is true that adversity can lead to people's growth. Doesn't always, but it can lead to growth. And I think that when it does, the adversity has a silver lining, and that's good. But remember, the personal growth isn't necessary if somebody doesn't come into existence. There's nobody who is deprived of that benefit of personal growth by ceasing to exist. By not coming into existence. And so you can avoid the unpleasantness that the person would experience and avoid the need for the growth, as it were, by not creating the person in the first place. So again, I would say that if people suffer adversity in life and they can make something good of it, that's great. I'm all in favor of that. But I don't think that that's a reason to create a new being who would suffer and then gain a benefit it wouldn't otherwise need.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to get away from that, keep falling into that trap, because like you just said, you know, this somebody isn't a somebody. It doesn't exist. But I guess is it just? Do you think it's pure sentimentality to just have the view that there's just that maybe that's where the beauty is, in a way, in that, yeah, there is nobody, and then you can create a somebody, and a somebody with potential that could potentially live an amazing life and do all these amazing things despite the inevitable pain that they're going to experience. That maybe that's where the beauty lies, in the fact that there's nobody there to begin with, and that you're able to create that.
I would say the reverse. I would say there's nobody there who's going to suffer, and now you're going to create a being that can. And it might be not suffering which has no silver lining, but still, why would you create a being that can suffer? And especially if you recognize the point that there's going to be more of that than of the good. So I'm not denying that there is the good. When you see your children playing on the beach and enjoying that, that's all great. And I think the more of that you can get in life, the better. That's fantastic. But you do need to keep some perspective and recognize those are relatively rare moments.
Okay, so I mean, I was thinking about this again, and again, I worry that I'm running into the same conceptual mistake, but I think this might straddle it in an interesting way, potentially. You've probably heard all this before, but I'm gonna give it a go anyway. And just because it's a personal account, David, don't go easy on me. Like, if I'm talking bollocks, let me know. But I was thinking about this, and so, like I say, my dad passed away. It's gonna be 4 weeks on Saturday now, and so my dad died because he had something called myotonic dystrophy. It's a form of muscular dystrophy, and that's a disease that just wastes a person away until the body just won't function anymore. And so, sort of based on this premise, let's say, sort of, Marty McFly, somehow you're in a time travel machine. David Benatar ends up sitting next to my grandma and granddad. They're sat on a park bench and they're getting a bit flirty. And if they're not careful, my dad's going to come into existence. And so, for you, the thing you would say is, hang on a minute, calm down, this isn't a good idea. But and the thing is, let's even say that you knew what was going to happen to my dad. And some of the big events that, I mean, my dad got hit by a truck when he was on a motorbike, and got seriously injured in his youth, and then he ended up infertile as well from an illness, because I'm adopted. Him and my mum couldn't have kids, and then he got struck down with this myotonic dystrophy, which was just 20 years of waste, slowly wasting away. But saying that, I know for a fact that if I would have asked my dad, was it worth it? Was being brought into existence worth it? He would have said, hell yeah, it was. And the question that sort of arises out of that is, why place more weight on the objective verdict of the philosopher rather than the subjective verdict of each individual person? Because surely the verdicts, that retrospective verdict of my dad, despite all his suffering, which was, he got more than his fair share, he would have said, yeah, man, that was worth it, and I reckon he'd say I'd do it again if I could.
So I don't think that people are thinking clearly when they make these judgments. Okay. And I think they are operating on the program, as it were, the psychological way in which we are programmed. Beings that have this more optimistic outlook are more likely to reproduce and spread their genes. Now, that was interfered with in another way with your father, but it doesn't undermine the fact that his psychology would have been explained, like all of ours is, by our evolutionary background. So I think there's a very good explanation for why people are positive. And I think that's both a good thing and a bad thing, because let's imagine your dad had the view that it was not worth it, that this was all completely gratuitous and completely unnecessary. Think about how much harder that would have been for him to bear if he'd had that view. And so there's a way in which this is a kind of psychological anesthetic. The optimism bias that we have is a kind of psychological anesthetic that makes life, or even an analgesia, perhaps, if you like, that makes life a bit more bearable. But the downside is that it also makes people more likely to reproduce and thereby spread the misery. And so it's not without its disadvantages. It's got some advantages, that feature of our psychology, but it's also got some disadvantages. Now, you ask, why should the philosopher's view should be accepted over the view of the ordinary person? And my view is, well, it shouldn't unless I'm right. And the question then is whether I am right. And I think the way we do that, the way we examine that and determine that, is by looking at the arguments and the evidence. But I also want to distinguish, again, between the case of creating the person and the case of somebody ceasing to exist. So I'm all in favor, when it comes to decisions about terminating life, to leave that up to the individual. Although I think individuals can be mistaken about that as well, and I think many people live longer than is actually good for them, all things considered, I think that is really an individual decision, because you're making that for yourself, and if you're wrong, you bear the costs. But when you create a new person, you're actually making a choice that's going to have ramifications for somebody else. Now, it's not that I think that therefore I should climb in. So had I seen your grandparents flirting on the park bench, I would likely not have done anything, because who wants the meddling philosopher interfering with your love life? It's not going to go down well. People in that kind of mood are not going to be interested in listening to antinatalist arguments. There are lots of pragmatic reasons for why I think one ought not to go around scolding newly married couples and telling them not to procreate. There are lots of pragmatic reasons for that. But the question about whether people should be procreating is a very different kind of question from whether you should be continuing to exist.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm missing something conceptually there, but like you say, so let's take away this idea of meddling, but just that idea that you're prior to the conception of somebody like my dad or whoever, and you see that scenario, and it's like that's a bad idea because you're bringing into existence somebody that's going to suffer, and then that person is brought into existence and they do suffer. And even despite I'm well aware of all these sort of cognitive biases that people are subject to. If that is the person's verdict at the end, whether it's seen through a sort of a lens of delusion for whatever reason, if the answer they give is at least of sound mind, let's say, then surely that makes you were wrong about that.
Well, first of all, you put the qualification sound mind. And there's a question about what you mean by that.
Well, I mean, I think it just meant that I'm imagining. I mean, I know we have to be careful about these sort of super specific examples. I'm trying to stay away from that, really. I'm just thinking about the example of someone who has suffered and maybe suffered quite badly, and they're nearing the end. And when by of sound mind, I mean it's the delusions, if they're experiencing any, are things like heuristic ones and cognitive biases. Not that they're drugged out of the mind and don't know what they're talking about.
Okay, but so here's an analogy. It's not a perfect analogy, but no analogy is. So let's imagine somebody was breeding a slave class of humans, and they bred them with a sort of altered psychology. And the only feature of the psychology was altered was that they actually were happy to have been created and created as members of the slave class. So you've got, let's say, some evil scientist who's slavery's been outlawed and people disapprove of slavery, but now he can produce this class of people that can do work and act of a certain kind, sort of slave-like work, but they'll enjoy it and they'll endorse it and they'll be pleased that they were brought into existence to serve this purpose. I don't think that we would exonerate the scientist, let's say, who was creating these people, even though the products were endorsing it, because we would recognize that their endorsement of it was a kind of, as they said, an adaptive preference. It was engineered, as it were, by the scientist. Well, in the evolutionary scenario, there's no scientist or God, let's say, that is engineering this, but it's a blind process that is engineering the endorsement of one's coming into existence. I don't think it's relevantly different. I think we should still be very, 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 very skeptical.
Yeah, see, I don't know. I see what you're getting at, David, but it's almost like that analogy just feels too far removed from a realistic scenario where, people do have that experience where they get to the end of their lives and they say, I had a good life. And it's not, I don't know. I think the sort of, with the analogy of like slavery, we're talking about a sort of it's there's a different sort of oppression going on there than just the real nuts and bolts trials and tribulations of being part of the human species.
Look, I do grant there's a difference. There has to be, and if I had an analogy that was sort of less stark, then it would be too much like the actual case for you to be convinced that you wouldn't see the differences. But let me perhaps put the point in a different way. So we've got good evidence that when people recollect their past, they recollect the good more than the bad.
Right.
So let's imagine somebody's at the end of their life and they're thinking back on their life. They're going to think about those wonderful moments of watching the children on the beach and the time they met their spouse, and they're going to think about those things. They're not going to think about, at least to the same extent, all the bad things that happened. So when they're weighing up the good and the bad from hindsight, as it were, they're not making a fully informed decision. We've got good evidence that they're not making a fully informed decision. So why would we take that as a reliable indicator of whether their life really was worth it?
Yeah, I guess, but surely that sort of retrospective analysis is going to be dependent on somebody's sort of individual psychology. And we sort of touched upon this idea of optimists versus pessimists, which I guess, in that sense, if somebody's going to, somebody that's maybe suicidal they're the sort of person, somebody who goes on to commit suicide, they're the sort of person who, when they look at the current situation and maybe the life retrospectively and weighing things up and just say this is the negativity there is overwhelming.
Yes,
I've had enough of this. But for those people that are optimistic, or that are able to see their lives as positive, and even if there's that positive bias there, so long as the person who is at the end of the life, if that's their verdict, despite all these sort of philosophical tricks of the mind that are going on, and I think we sort of have to be careful about using them as part of the argument, because those philosophical tricks are going on all the time anyway. It's not just when people are evaluating lives retrospectively and memories, and those hallucinations and delusions are going on all the time. Almost.
So I think you mean psychological tricks as opposed to philosophical tricks. Is that correct?
Yeah, psychological tricks that are going on all the time. Because they're going on all the time, it's sort of, for me, it sort of discounts their influence when somebody gets to the end of the life and they're assessing it retrospectively, because those illusions, delusions are going on all the time anyway. It's part of the human condition. So it's almost just like when that person's got to the end of the life, regardless of those little tricks of the mind, if their verdict is that it was worth it, that still to me sort of discounts the antinatalist at the beginning saying, probably shouldn't have that kid, it's a bad idea.
I don't think so. So let me say a few things about that. First of all, you seem to be assuming a kind of infallibility on people's part in assessing whether their life was worth starting. But if you think it was worth starting, if you think it was all worth it, then it is. But I don't see why people must be infallible about this when they're not infallible about other things. Humans are fallible in all kinds of ways. There's no reason why we shouldn't think they can be fallible about this. Can't be fallible about this too.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's that, David. I don't think I'm ascribing a sort of infallibility. I think I'm ascribing maybe primacy of opinion. Like, surely the best person to decide whether or not they've had a good life is the person that subjectively experienced it.
Not necessarily, no. Not necessarily, because they may be making all kinds of errors. I mean, often it's the case that people, other than oneself, can see things about one better than one can see in oneself. It's not an uncommon phenomenon. But let me make the more general point. So you've spoken about all these sort of cognitive biases, and what we know as a result of those is that we as humans often think and behave irrationally. Now, the typical response to that, if one's thinking about scary, I mean, I'm not saying the response from the person on the street, but the typical response from thoughtful people is going to be, well, if there are these cognitive biases and we can be made aware of them and we can correct for these irrationalities in some way, we would be better off. We might be sparing ourselves all kinds of bad things. So if we think that in that case, well, why shouldn't we also think it in assessments about whether your life was worth starting? I mean, we don't just sort of recognize these cognitive biases and say, well, that's it, and there's nothing that we should do about it. People are irrational, and so they're irrational. Let's just let them in. Let's let them just wallow in their irrationality. What we try to do is organize things in a certain way, structure the environment in a certain way, such as to correct for these irrationalities, try to make people deliberate and think in clearer ways. I mean, half the value of recognizing these cognitive biases is in order to try to correct for them to the extent that we can. We don't just acknowledge them and say, well, that's the way we are, and we're going to do nothing about it.
To that extent, then, again, I think we'll make this the last hypothetical person on the deathbed scenario, and then because I've got some sort of bigger questions to address. If we have a person who is well aware of the cognitive biases and has done their damnedest to correct for them in the retrospective analysis, and have been very sort of thorough in trying to, as they've sort of gone back over the life, trying to actually remember the negative experiences. And I don't even think that's too much of an unreasonable or unrealistic hypothetical scenario. You know, there are people that are extremely rationally minded. There are people that are sort of educated in these things that will inevitably and have inevitably gone through the process of death, that would be able to and that will have spent time going back over their lives and thinking about it. So would you concede that it's worthwhile to ascribe more value to the opinion of that sort of person that would be aware of those cognitive biases and that would be more critical of their own life retrospectively, that if they still said on balance that it was worth it, that their opinion is maybe worth more than, you know, somebody was more ignorant to those things?
I think it's going to be very hard to assess who's actually done that work successfully and who hasn't done.
Right.
Because I would argue that if you do that work successfully, you will reach a different conclusion.
Right. Yes.
You won't reach a conclusion. So in other words, what I'm suggesting is that the hypothetical you're imagining is one that won't work. It doesn't depict anything in reality. That you're not going to get somebody who both recognizes and takes due account of everything that's happened in their life and yet reaches the conclusion that you've said about being happy to have been brought into existence.
Right. So yeah. So if someone was able to have that completely unfiltered, honest view of their life looking back, inevitably they would realize that it hadn't been worth it. That's what you're saying.
Well, that's my view.
Yeah.
But I'm acknowledging that we can't actually work out who has and hasn't done compensatory work properly, which is why I think we need to fall back on the earlier arguments I was giving about why there's more bad than good, and why we ought to prioritize the avoidance of the bad over the establishment of the good through creating new people. So that's why I think those earlier arguments are where we should be giving our focus.
Okay, so moving on a bit, one thing I'm interested in is whether this is there's a level of moral relativism to this argument. I'm wondering if the scale of immorality being committed by bringing new life into the world is sort of culturally dependent or dependent on socioeconomic status or time period. So, for instance, quickly, is it more immoral for say somebody in India who's dirt poor and not in a stable relationship, is it more immoral for them to bring a life into the world than it is for somebody who's, say, wealthy, lives in the Western world with, you know, inevitably more opportunities and safeguards for a child being brought into the world? Or is it absolute? It doesn't matter either way?
Well, I think we need to qualify the question in certain ways, because you're asking a slightly different kind of question about the morality or the immorality of the action as opposed to the goodness or badness of coming into existence.
Yeah.
And it may be that, let's say that the child produced by the person in the poor parts of the world is more likely to suffer, and so their life is more likely, and that's important, more likely to be worse than the child born, let's say, in a wealthy part of the world. But it doesn't follow that the parents creating that child are worse, because it might be, for example, that they don't have access to contraception in the way in which the people in the developed world do. There are large parts of the world where there's insufficient access to contraception even when people want it. So there may be sort of mitigating considerations. So I want to say less about, blaming the parents or blaming procreators, and look more at the question about how bad it is to come into existence. And there I would acknowledge that it is worse to come into some existences than it is into others. But there are multiple variables that determine how bad it is. Socioeconomic condition is one, but that doesn't mean to say that the richer you are, the better off you are, because there can be certain perils that come with being richer, and also certain dangers for others that come with being richer, because richer people tend to be bigger consumers, tend to have worse impacts on the environment per capita. And so now we come to a different kind of antinatalist argument, by the way, not what I call the philanthropic ones, but the misanthropic ones. This is about the kind of damage that a child you create will do for others, will inflict on others. So there's a very complex story to be told here. And I don't want to just say, well, if you're poor and you have a child, you do something worse than if you're rich and you have a child. On one axis, that might be true. but it may well be true that you're not destitute and your child will lead a relatively impoverished life, but it will have better values and be less spoiled, and perhaps it won't get some awful disease that a particular child in richer circumstances will. So there are lots of variables we need to be taking into account. And the big point is that we can't always predict those. Can't always predict what's going to happen. In fact, we can never predict what's going to happen in an individual life. We can know what the odds are with regard to certain variables, but we can't predict entirely.
Okay, another quite big question, I guess, is there anything that, I guess, is there anything we could do as a species, as a civilization or whatever, to sort of tip the balance in favour of goodness being the likely outcome in a person's life, enough for the antinatalist to sort of concede defeat and say, you know what, the needle's swung enough in the other direction that maybe it is okay to start bringing people into the world?
The short answer is no. But the longer answer is that your question suggests that there's a balance, and now we're going to tip the balance in the other direction. Whereas if my earlier arguments are correct, there's not a balance. There's a massive lopsiding between the amount of bad that there is and the amount of good. Now, I don't deny that there are things that we can do to reduce the amount of suffering and unpleasantness and badness that there is in the world. We have done, as a species, lots of things to reduce that, and I'm sure that more could be done. But I very much doubt that we could ever get things so good that it would be better to come into existence than not to come into existence. One reason for that, the more controversial reason, is that so long as there is anything bad in life, that axiological asymmetry speaks against creating new people, because there's nothing to be gained. However much good there is in life, and no matter how little bad there is, as long as there's some bad, nothing is going to be gained by producing a person. Now, that's the more controversial claim. But even if we look just at the empirical asymmetries, I think that suffering and unpleasantness is so deeply written into the structure of sentient life that we could never eradicate the evils to such an extent that coming into existence wouldn't be that bad.
Okay.
I think thinking that could happen, I think, is unduly optimistic. I know there are people who do think that. The people who think we're going to be able to eradicate disease, we're going to be able to eradicate death. Let me put this way: I'm not holding my breath.
Yeah, no, I've got to say, David, I'm not feeling very optimistic about that one myself either. Flip it.
And the other thing to recognize, so I think to recognize here is that when we do have advancing technologies, they can be put to good and bad use. And so often they do reduce the amount of suffering, but often they don't. Often they increase it. So if you think about how many people can now be killed in a short space of time, halfway across the world, well, it's much, much greater now than it was a century ago. In fact, it probably didn't exist a century ago. But now we can do that. A nuclear bomb set off at a distance could kill millions of people in an instant. And even if you think about the conventional weapons that we have, they can cause much more damage than what happened before. So technology can be used for good and it can be used for bad.
Okay, flipping this around the other way. So the people trying to convince the antinatalists, they've got no chance. So, and like we said at the beginning, so given that the antinatalist view isn't synonymous with pro-mortalism, so we're not saying, right, because everyone's suffering, everybody should kill themselves. What, I know this is going to be purely hypothetical, but what's the most desirable but realistic? So we have to sort of work within the constraints of realism. The most desirable and realistic path towards a sort of antinatalist utopia. What's the best way to bringing about the end of the propagation of the species?
Well, again, I'd question the question, because I don't think there's going to be a utopia, and certainly not going to be one that's brought about by us. And I even think that trying to bring about a perceived utopia is going to be a bad thing. If you look at utopian ideals and the history of utopian ideals, they often cause more misery than they produce good. So I would be very, very reticent. In fact, more than reticent, I would oppose efforts to go out and actively prevent people using coercive state power from procreating. This is not going to end well if you do that. This is going to lead to bloodshed and unpleasantness, and so I'm pessimistic even about the ability to bring about a better state of affairs. I think a better state of affairs will eventually come about. In other words, there will be a time when there is no more sentient life on Earth, but that will not be as a result of our intentionally doing that. It may come as a result of our unintentionally doing it. It might be a side effect of some other stupid actions that we engage in. But I don't think we should be working towards utopia. I suppose what I would say to individuals is you can make decisions for yourself. Make them wisely. You can decide whether to procreate or not. You can decide whether you're going to be responsible for a new being that's going to suffer and die. And that is within your control and the control of your partner. Make that decision wisely.
Okay, so just okay. I'll play with a hypothetical here, because it just intrigues me. Is there any sort of scenario in which let's say we could make Professor David Benatar omnipotent? Is there any way of bringing it about that way? I think I've thought of one, David. let me run this past you. So, when I was reading the forums, again, it's all about everybody should commit suicide, or it'd be great if we could have a bomb go off and blah blah blah. And then your argument as well is one of the arguments is that even if we could make it so that everybody went to sleep, all 7 billion people in the world went to sleep and they just never woke up again, that's fine because they wouldn't know that they died. But you argue that they've still been deprived of something because the people that already exist, they're already here, they have goals, they have meaning, and that's being taken away from them. Mm-hmm. But let me try this one. Whether you'd give this the go ahead or not. If there was some way to just sort of mass a godlike clicking of the fingers and everybody becomes infertile, then that generation of people, they're not having their lives taken away from them. They are. This is just the last generation on the planet. They're just not able to procreate, and as a result of that, yes, obviously, it's going to be upsetting for people because people wanted to have children. Natural evolutionary drive to do so, and all that malarkey. But still, by making everybody sterile, you haven't taken everybody's lives away from them. You've caused an inconvenience, but the amount of suffering, potential and future suffering that you've prevented, would that make it worthwhile for you? Would you click your fingers and say, "Let's do that one"?
Well, it's complicated. You're postulating I've got omnipotence. So let me say that if I had omnipotence, I'd also want omniscience.
Right.
And if I had both of those, then I'd be much better equipped to make that decision than I am now.
Well, let's take away the omnipotence and the omniscience, and it's just you as David sat there now.
But I can't do that. The omnipotence is required there for this hypothetical. Me just sitting here making a decision is going to have no impact on the fertility of all the world's people. No, so you're imagining a scenario where I can, at the click of my fingers or the push of a button, make everybody infertile.
Yeah.
And it's not that I think there are no moral questions there. There are moral questions because in pressing that button or clicking those fingers, I would be interfering with the reproductive freedom of people. Now, It is true that I think people ought not to be using their freedom in a particular way, but it is a separate question whether I should be interfering with them or not.
Yes.
And one reason why you might think, and I'm not saying I wouldn't, but one reason you think I might not, that I ought not to, is because I could be mistaken about all of this. I mean, I don't think I'm mistaken, but I could be mistaken. And that's why I'm sort of worried about the coupling of omnipotence with very human levels of understanding. If you're going to have the omnipotence, you sort of want to have the omniscience to match it. If you're going to be making decisions that can be affecting that number of people, you need to be able to be much more confident of the rectitude of your position, of the veracity of your opinion, than you need to be if you've got very little power. And so I think one thing that we ought to do is, where we recognize our limitations, we ought to limit our power, as it were. In fact, that's one important argument in the history of philosophy for limiting power, including limiting state power, is that humans are not infallible. And the people who are going to get hold of take control of the government, they're not going to be infallible. There need to be restrictions on the amount of power that they have.
Right, okay. So I was going to segue into one question here. I've got a couple which these are some that I've seen posed on the forums, which I think they seem tricky questions. If you'd rather not answer them, let me know. I'll chop this little bit out. The first one is, what's the antinatalist, and from a purely pragmatic standpoint, I'd like to come at this, because again, it can be too much of an emotive topic, and I'm not a fan of sort of emotional hysterics. But just from a pragmatic standpoint, what is the sort of the antinatalist view of abortion? I would rephrase that one as, when it comes to like a miscarriage. When a woman has a miscarriage, surely from the antinatalist perspective, that's a good thing. But I'm just wondering what you would say is the position on that.
So I don't think that antinatalism per se implies anything about abortion.
Okay.
I think you have to couple with antinatalism a particular view about when we come into existence in a morally relevant way.
Yes.
So let's imagine you thought that we come into existence in a morally relevant way at the time of conception. Well, then abortion is not stopping somebody from coming to exist. It's taking somebody out of existence.
Of course, yes.
If, on the other hand, you think that we come into existence, let's say, at the end of the second trimester, well, then if you have an abortion before that, you're preventing somebody from coming into existence. And if you have an abortion after that, then you're taking somebody out of existence. So there's a separate question to be asked here, and that is about when we come into existence in the morally relevant way. And you have to couple that view with antinatalism in order to determine what your view about abortion would be. Yes,
of course. Okay, I like this one. This is one on this is a sort of a less severe version of the why don't all the antinatalists just go kill themselves argument. How much antinatalists stand by their convictions, and this is that surely antinatalists should abstain from sex because yes, protection, yes, the pill, blah blah blah, but it's not 100%. And so if there's any risk whatsoever of bringing life into the world, every antinatalist should surely be completely celibate for life.
Well, even that isn't 100%. I mean, somebody can be raped, and so nothing is 100%. So there are a few things. First of all, we've got pretty good methods of contraception available. There are also methods of sterilization available. And people can have access to these, at least in many parts of the world, if not, although not all parts of the world. And so there are lots of ways in which people can engage in sexual activity, which makes their lives better in all kinds of ways, and all to the good, without creating new people. And then if you do think that abortion is permissible under some circumstances, if you think, for example, that we do not come into existence in the morally relevant way at conception, well, then there's always abortion as a backup, at least for women, if not for men, to avoid creating new people. And finally, I would say that I don't think that the zero risk standard is the standard that we're obliged to use. So I'm opposed to killing people, but that doesn't mean to say that I'm never going to drive a car, even though driving a car stands some risk of killing somebody.
Yeah, that's a good one, that, David. No, okay. My final question.
So good news for the antinatalists is that sex is still on the table.
Yes, I can just imagine a load of all the antinatalists jotting that one down now, just in case they need to use that excuse. Okay.
Not just on the table, maybe better in the bed and other places.
Okay, so final question, I guess, before we jump into the quick fire questions. And I'm going to ask you this because I don't suppose I'm capable of getting to it by myself. So I'm going to ask you to sort of argue against yourself here. But I'm just intrigued I'm just wondering what's the strongest argument that you've come up against for your position that's maybe made you step back and go, oh God, hang on a minute, that's a good point you've got there.
I don't know how to answer that because now many of the arguments that I've heard so many times before. An intelligent response to arguments. I read them very charitably and at first thought that there was more to them than I thought after reading them more carefully. So perhaps that's a good thing that I had a more charitable view initially in reading them. I'm often sort of impressed by an argument and think, oh, that's something to think about. But it might not be as impressive once you think about it in detail. It's hard for me to say. It's hard for me to think of a particular argument that I would say, now that is really the most powerful argument that I've considered. But there's certainly many that are better than others. I think the initial arguments that I heard were dismissive arguments, and there's still some of that kind. And then there are ones that are just much more thoughtful, that are engaging my arguments in detail, seriously, charitably. And those are invariably the ones that it's worth spending more time considering. So I know that's not quite the kind of answer you want, but if I had to get into the details now, we probably wouldn't have time for that.
Just finally, David, what's interesting is I've come up against, I've thrown these arguments at you, and you've come back at me, and for the most part, I'd say, except on an emotional level, but from a pure logical standpoint, I can't fight back very well. But regardless of that, I still know, like, my position hasn't moved at all on this idea of, do I still want to have this third baby? And I still really do, despite knowing all the things you've just told me. And I guess that just, do you think that's maybe the biggest hurdle that the antinatalist position has to overcome, or maybe not overcome in like that bigger political sense, but just the biggest thing that the antinatalist position is arguing against is sentiment and emotion?
We're up against millennia of biology. That's not going to be easy to overcome. But the phenomenon that you're describing is not unusual. It doesn't apply just to antinatalist arguments. There are many arguments in the course of human history that have sounded outrageous to people, which in retrospect we take to be entirely plausible. Think about objections to slavery, for example. You give very compelling arguments against slavery, but slaveholders are going to have a deep resistance to accepting them. Arguments, let's say, for the equality of women and men. You can have excellent arguments for that, but in a deeply unequal society, a deeply sexist society, people are going to have a hard time internalizing those. I think in our own times, you can give excellent arguments for why we ought not to be treating animals in the way in which we're treating them. And when I do express arguments of that kind to many people, they say, well, I get it cognitively, but I really like steak. So this is not an uncommon phenomenon. And I think what we ought to do is recognize that the counterintuitiveness of an idea is not by itself an indication of the badness of the idea. And that things that are widely accepted can be deeply wrong, and we need to just think very carefully about them and recognize our biases and the things that are going to stand in the way of our seeing what might be true.
Okay, David, let's jump into these quickfire questions and then I can let you go. But first, before we do that, because as always, the quickfire questions are just for the people supporting on Patreon, which is patreon.com/myownworstenemy. You can pledge for as little as $2 a month there to gain access to this content. Before we do that, have you got any links anywhere you'd like to direct the listeners? Any sort of social media websites, anything like that?
No, I'm not really on social media. In fact, not really. I'm not at all on social media. But obviously, there are the books which are available through Amazon and other places. So if people would like to read more, they're welcome to do so. I would say that The Human Predicament is probably a more accessible book for a general audience, so a non-philosopher audience. But it's also less directly focused on antinatalism. Whereas Better Never to Have Been is more directly focused on antinatalism. And though it is more technical, I do have a sort of reader's guide at the beginning, which suggests what parts might be skipped for those who want to avoid the more difficult and technical parts. And I certainly had lots of non-philosophers who have read the book and understood it. And so I don't think it's entirely beyond the reach of a non-philosopher.
Yeah, well, and I will add, David, so I've only just managed to sort of dip in and out of both your books in lead up to this, but the Human Predicament is, I don't know how often you hear this, but the bits I delved into, I found it really fun. It's like a fun read. I think just because it's such the way you write and things is like you said, is very accessible, but I just think some of the concepts in there are going to be so new to people, especially how deeply you delve into it. And yeah, I can't wait to tear into that book properly. But I'd definitely recommend that one. So, okay. Okay, folks, if you enjoyed this episode or you're enjoying this podcast in general and you'd like to help support it, there are a number of ways you can do so. You can make a one-off donation for as little as £1. Just go to myownworstenemy.org/support. If you can't afford to make a donation, there are a couple of other ways you could help us out that won't cost you much more than a couple of minutes of your time. Firstly, you could leave us a positive review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, as it's called nowadays. Just search for My Own Worst Enemy podcast, open the reviews tab, and then click write a review. I think that's what it says you have to do on Google anyway. I don't know, I don't use iTunes, but yeah, that's a good way of encouraging people to give us a listen. You could leave us a positive review on our Facebook page. That's always very much appreciated. Just go to facebook.com/myownworstenemy.org. You don't have to actually write a review either. If you can't be arsed, just click on 5 stars and I've done with it. Or 4. 4 stars is fine. Any less than 4, I'd rather you didn't bother, to be honest. But, it's up to you. Do what you want. If you'd rather not be so public about your endorsements, you'd rather just sort of blow smoke up my ass in a more private setting, that's fine as well. Just drop me an email, which is danny@myownworstenemy.org. Or, if you're really old-fashioned, you don't do iTunes, you don't do Facebook, you don't do email, just tell somebody, good old-fashioned word of mouth, that always works as well. So yeah, that's enough validation seeking for one day, methinks. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you again next time.